Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to go through the SEND Green Paper. This is a webinar put on by the NNPCF and with help with our colleagues in Contact. So it's a joint NNPCF Contact webinar. And my name is Mrunal Sisodia, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the NNPCF.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tina Emery and I'm the other co-chair of the NNPCF. And thank you for joining us today on a Monday. Please, can we ask that you switch off your cameras and mute yourselves while we're going through the presentation. Please, of course, use the chat function if you've got any questions, and we'll try and answer some of the questions, although we might, just depending on the pace, go through the presentation first, but we'll certainly come back to you with any of the questions that we don't answer. This session is being recorded and it will be available at a later stage on the Contact website. Thank you.
Great. So today's session is focused on the SEND Green Paper. And this is very much the NNPCF briefing, and the subtitle you've got there on the slide really is what we're going to do today. We're going to unpack the green paper for you. So no apologies today, but this is going to be quite a dense presentation because it is quite a dense green paper. It's 104 pages, I think, if I remember rightly. And whilst we won't step through 104 pages, what we are going to do is go through every single of the significant proposals in there, really try and tell you what they say, what we think they mean for children and families of SEND, and give you our view on whether we are supportive or otherwise of those proposals. So that's really a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. It is interactive. At one point, once we've actually been through what the green paper actually says, we'll pause and we're going to use the wonderful tools that we have with Mentimeter, which allows you to tell us what your thoughts are at this stage. And this is going to be incredibly valuable for us as we continue to shape our engagement with the Department for Education and others over the coming weeks and months. So without any further ado, I'll get going, and over to you, Tina.
Thank you. So we're going to go through a very brief background of why we're here, and also touch on what's gone wrong in the SEND system. We'll then be looking at what the green paper proposes, and we'll go through that with Mrunal, and then we'll do a bit of summing up. And it's also about how we can get involved. So there's quite a few things that we're doing as the National Network Parent Care Forums, whether it's in your region, whether it's nationally as well. So we will go through that at the end of the presentation. So the NNPCF played a very small part in getting the SEND review set up. We had a meeting, actually it was my first meeting as the co-chair, and we went to the House of Commons and actually spoke to Nadeem Sahari. And we sort of said, look, we need a review into the systems. The system that is currently being used isn't quite fit for purpose. And there's a few reasons as to that, why that was, and we'll go through that in a second. But we said, you know, the two most important things was that there wasn't proper funding for the SEND services. What we knew is that local services struggled to manage you know, the amount of children, young people they have coming through their systems, but also the fact that government works in silos, whether it's local government or whether it's national. And actually we wanted something that overarched everything to actually address these issues within the system. So then essentially different departments talk to one another about these children and young people. So this is how it's sort of panned out, and it has been a long time in coming. I don't know how many times we heard that it was being delayed, and there was going to be an interim report. So basically they set up a review in September 2019, and it was being led by a chap called Mike Davis. And then of course the general election was called, and so we all went into purdah. So the review was halted. We then had a new government, and we knew with that we had new government ministers. So Vicky Ford became the Undersecretary for Children and Families, with Gavin Williamson as being Secretary of State for Education. And then an initial report was due to be delivered in spring 2021. But of course, then it didn't, because the coronavirus hit. And so everything got delayed. And then there was supposed to be a review into the school's white paper and children's social care review, which had been started, but an interim report was supposed to be released again in spring 2021, but it didn't. Mainly because of other things that are happening within the system, mainly because of coronavirus and people being in lockdown. And so the SEND review then got rebooted in September 2021, being led by Charlie Lang. And then we had another reshuffle. So Gavin Williamson and Vicky Ford left the building, and in came Nadeem Sahawi and Will Quince, and they came in September 2021. And then the Green Paper was launched again in March of 2022, and this is where we are now. So there we go. So we were invited onto the SEND Review Steering Group rather late. We only came into it just before Christmas of 2021. And we had 6 meetings where we fundamentally told them from a parent carer point of view, things that we needed to add, things that we want to change, some red lines. And it was a very sort of good conversations that we had. They did listen to some of the things that we said, but of course, the final draft was released, and you know, we'd actually only had seen one draft at that point. Next slide, please. So what's gone wrong with the SEND system? Now, some of you might think lots have gone wrong in the SEND system, but actually the reforms that came in 2014 were, we feel, the right reforms, but it was definitely in the wrong environment, which means there was less money in the system. There was, you know, the right reforms was good co-production, not confrontation. It needs to be personal centred, not provision led. And that's looking at the child's needs to make sure that the needs of the children are being met, and joint working, which is what I touched on earlier in the earlier slide. So not silo working, cross-government or local government departments working together. So the wrong environment is that there's not enough money in the system, and the money that is in the system is not being used effectively. Lots of forums say that the money needs to be ring-fenced, and it's certainly something that we've always talked about. Incentives and accountabilities for leaders. So the schools actually aren't incentivized to be inclusive. If you look at Progress 8 or the league tables, again, that is anti-SEND. SEND is often too low priority across health and social care. Those forums that work in local authorities around EHCP panel, for instance, will know that sometimes health and social care don't come to those meetings. Or even if you've got a child's annual review, actually, you know, who turns up to the annual review process? And again, it's about the fact that it seems to be a low priority, so we need more health and social care involvement, and of course poor accountability, which is one of the major factors that we have lots of conversations around in regards to this Green Paper as well. So leaders and managers and staff aren't equipped to support and deliver. They don't know the law. In fact, sometimes forums know more than what they do, and they haven't made cultural changes. So when it becomes embedded, we talk about this all the time, when they do a new plan or a new strategy, it needs to be embedded. And is it that cultural changes that people actually wanting to do what's needed to succeed? And there isn't enough co-production, whether it's strategic or individual. So, you know, we really need to embed that into the Green Paper. So what does impact this have? Too many children with SEND or in mainstream schools have poor experience. And what we know about that is where it fails, they end up either leaving education or they end up in expensive, probably independent provisions, or possibly in specialists. And maybe they don't, you know, they don't need to necessarily be there. They need to be in the mainstream schools. EHCs are very mixed quality. There's often services that are not being delivered, and often they're not even written into the plan, and it's not quantifiable either. That tends to be something that we get to hear about all the time, the fact that things aren't written in, or if they are, it's not actually telling somebody how much they need to deliver, when and how often. Families then are on a cliff edge with their young person when they leave education, because the steps haven't happened to then follow on. So if they leave school, is the steps then being put into college or further education? And then when that happens, what happens then? So if you've got a child with very complex needs and they've been in college and they've had an EHCP and they've been there probably until their early 20s, what happens then? What's the next steps? And often it's just nothing's been put into place. There's long waits for key health services in regards to, say, for instance, speech and language or T, or even appointments within hospital settings, and difficulties in accessing children's social care. So carers assessments not being done or requested. And so what that ends up doing is that raises people's anger. They then go to tribunal because they feel that they have no other choice. And by doing that, then the trust within the local systems are lost. And this is what we fed back to the Department for Education. So we're not the only ones that are saying this. In fact, the Education Select Committee did a report into SEND, and there's also been the Timpson Review on school exclusions. There has been reports and they developed the pilot for the redress. So the tribunal systems where you redress, which includes recommendations for health and social care, and that report is now live and has been released since. And then of course the National Audit Office report into SEND. And findings from Ofsted and CQC inspections, what we now know is that there are more local authorities that have got written statement of action in regards to joint inspections. And then there's also the new Ofsted school framework where they're looking in particular at SEND children within that. And of course, the Special Educational Consortium that issue key position statements, as well as the DCP, so the Disabled Children's Partnership, have also highlighted issues within this sector. So the problems with the SEND system is that there are players in the system that are not incentivised to prioritise SEND, which we've just touched on in previous slides: schools, progress 8, league tables. Not enough money in the system, so false economies are pursued. And then there's lack of clarity of what should be provided and who should be providing it, whether it's in an EHCP or SEN support. So this has then an impact on children and young people and their families. So children's needs are not identified, understood, or not met. And families then don't get services they need or are entitled to, mainly no early help offer, and then they end up pushing through the system. There isn't any accountability. There's a mismatch between responsibilities and powers and accountability in the system. And local authorities, schools, health commissioners and providers, regional schools, commissioners and tribunals. Again, it's very hot pot and very mismatched. And local authorities only have limited powers, especially when a school is an academy, for instance, and then it then becomes a regional schools commissioner's issue. But again, where is that accountability? Where do we know that families are actually getting some sort of response, especially when they make complaints? So families have no simple means of redress, touched on it very lightly there, and needs to escalate the new needs and develop. So for instance, behaviour and mental health, what we know about children with behaviour that challenges is that if it escalates, they're at risk of exclusion, and then they get permanently excluded, and then they're in that system of trying to find a placement that is fit for purpose. And often families reach crisis. So the intervention is that finally, sometimes the system acts, but only usually when a family is in crisis, and often it's too little too late. And by then the condition or the needs of that child becomes much worse and much harder to then unpick and actually get a provision that's suitable for the child's needs. And then there's the cost of that. So often those independent provisions cost more, and the emotional cost of that family is awful. And in the end, the trust is lost between a family and a local authority, and families then seek EHCPs and tribunals, especially if they don't get the EHCP, even at the needs assessment. And then the financial cost of the whole system then escalates, rising numbers of children in independent provisions, which then cost the DSG or the school's budgets. Money's taken out from schools. So it's an awful sort of vicious circle combination that escalates. And of course, finally, and most importantly, I suppose, for our world, is that the co-production is not embedded. If we actually co-produce with families that need the support, actually there should be less cost to the system. It should run more efficiently. So the problem is not, and let me be clear, it's definitely not pushy parents, and we are definitely not expecting too much, and definitely not tribunals are not too powerful. The statistics currently is 96% of tribunals find favour in the families, and it's definitely not a problem with demand. This is a problem about supply. It's about actually making sure that the local area understands its local families and make sure that there is provisions in place. And so if the families could get the right services at the right time, there would be no crisis. So what do we think needs to change? Well, we think that there should be minimum standards for services, and then be clear and actually understand what they need to do. Clarity on joint commissioning and who pays for what. There is always talk about pooled budgets, and often local authorities in particular and health get a bit protective about that and don't particularly like pooled budgets. How the money is allocated and how it's spent, accountability and inspections and data, and the right people, the right knowledge and the right skills in the right place, I would add as well. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Tina. So we thought, thank you for bearing with us that 15 minutes or so that we provided that background there, because the reason we wanted to give you that background was it's really important you know the history of where this green paper has come from, right? Because it's on the boil for a long while, and it's been through various iterations in the background, and we've only really been involved in the last 6 months in those iterations. The second thing I think is really, really critical is the reason we went through what we see the problem as being is because other people, other players in the system will give you a different opinion about what the problem is. And this green paper is critical that it answers the right question. If you get the problem analysis wrong, you're going to get the answer wrong. So that's why we took a little bit of time there to almost go over some slides that we have used before, some new slides, but mostly slides we've used before, just to reiterate what we have stated consistently over the last, really now getting on for 3 to 4 years, as to what we think the problem with the SEND system is. And what we're going to do now is actually go through what the green paper actually says and try and unpack what it says, and to look to what extent it actually addresses what we consider to be the real problems in the SEND sector, and to what extent it actually meets the recommendations that we have asked for. So when Tina and I were sitting on that green paper steering group, we kept plugging the lines that Tina has just been through. So to what extent have our lines found their way into the green paper? So let's just step through it. So the green paper is broken into these 5 main sort of policy areas. The first is a single national SEND and alternative provision system. The second is excellent provision from early years to adulthood. The third is reformed and integrated, that should say role, not toll for AP, apologies. System roles, accountabilities and funding reform. And then lastly, delivering change for children and families. 5 sections to the 5 major policy sections to the green paper. Let's step through each one of those. So on the left of these tables, what you're seeing there is the headline proposals as they are documented in the green paper. On the right hand side, what we've tried to do is give you what our verdict on those proposals are. So let's step through them. So most importantly, and we're delighted about this, is that it proposes a new national SEND and AP system setting out nationally consistent standards. We argued very, very robustly for the need for this. And the idea being, and I'll say a little bit more on this later, but if you have a national system, then you stop a lot of the postcode lotteries. It actually makes it much, much simpler. Parents know what they're entitled to. Schools know what support they can get from health services. Social workers know what they can expect from schools. Health services know what they can expect from schools and social. It just makes it a lot simpler. And that takes a lot of the rub out of the system, where the vagueness in the system, where a lot of the conflict is coming. The other thing it allows you to do is, once you set national standards up, it allows you to be very, very clear about who is responsible for delivering and paying for what. And if you've got those national standards, you can hang that who pays for what work off there. So again, the idea being it should make the system a lot simpler to implement. The next thing it does is then it removes a lot of the conflict, and therefore allows you to intervene earlier. If everybody knows what everybody's entitled to and what help they can expect from everybody else, the idea being that they can get that intervention in earlier. So this new national system of minimum standards is really important. Now, the risk for us is going to be, let's make sure that they're not really, really, really minimum standards. This shouldn't be a race to the bottom, but creating a reasonable floor of what we can expect for our children. Linked to that is the review and update of the SEND Code of Practice. So not a lot to say on that, and I think we'd all expect that. There's a requirement then, the third item on this page, to establish new local SEND partnerships to produce local inclusion plans, setting out how local areas will meet national standards. So there's a demand there, there's a requirement there for local areas to work together and create these partnerships and create local plans. Now, one of the things we've got to clarify there is, how will these plans be co-produced? But that's something we'll be working on. Let's talk of a standardized and digitized EHCP process and template. Again, removing a lot of the local variability in the standards for EHCPs. So the questions we've got around that is, what form will digitization and standardization take? And just to make sure it is accessible, because we all know that tech is not accessible to everybody. The language in EHCPs can be very formal and isn't accessible to everybody. We also know about things such as parents with SEND often have learning disabilities themselves, the learning difficulties themselves. We also know that parents of SEND come from all races, cultures, creeds, and languages. So there's things like that I think that we need to follow through on. Next up, support for parents and carers to express an informed preference for suitable placement by providing a tailored list of settings. This is a really big one. So what they are saying is that if you have an education, health and care plan, your local area will put up a list of suitable placements for that child. Now, I don't think it's going to be, there's a lack of clarity here. I don't think it's going to be one list, because clearly what will be required for a child with visual impairments will be completely different from a child with, say, autism versus a child with profound and multiple physical needs. So I don't think it can be one single list, but we're talking about a list to choose from. And the key question here is going to be, how will that list be produced? Tina sometimes calls it the magic list, and I think that's going to stick. That's going to, if we all call it our magic list. How will that list be produced? What role will parents, both strategically, as through parent care reforms, for example, have in producing that list? And individual parents, what role will individual parents have in producing that list? If, for example, if they have heard of or know of a school that is really great, they think is perfect for their child, will that school be able to go on the list? And critically, what will happen if the parents do not think any of the schools on that list are suitable for their child? So this issue of the magic list is one we're going to return to, and it, I think, is a central point of these proposals that, frankly, at this point, we can see being very, very problematic. The next line is also really important, in that they're talking about streamlining the redress process, including through mandatory mediation. So the proposals state that before you go to tribunal, there will be a requirement to go to mandatory mediation. a lot of questions open on this. So will the mediation be binding? Because if it's not, is it really worth the paper that it's written on? So will there be a requirement for the local area to implement the mediation, the outcome of the mediation properly? What happens if a parent actually fundamentally disagrees with the outcome of a mediation? Can they still go to tribunal? How effective will the mediation be? What will happen if the requirements from the mediation aren't put into place? Is it just going to act, is that family going to end up in tribunal anyway? And will this just be a delay mechanism? These are the sorts of issues we need to work through. Now, the stats on mediation are actually quite positive in the sense that, don't quote me on this, but I think it's something like 70% of families who go to mediation are actually happy with what the outcome is. Those are the national stats at the moment. But how it's going to be implemented here is really, really important. The next slide talks about the next big chapter, which is excellent provision from early years to adulthood. And I'm going to speed up a bit here because actually the really bulky proposals are actually in that first slide. So there's a lot in this section around the additional monies that the Department of Education is putting into education. I won't go through that. You know, we're not spokespeople for the DFE. They can speak to the additional monies themselves. There's a requirement now to consult on a new SENCO national qualification, which is, again, Tina talked earlier about us being very clear around the need to upskill staff, particularly in schools. There's a talk of a commission analysis to better understand the requirements that SEND have of the health workforce. There's something about a reference across to the school's white paper, and we'll talk more about the school's white paper in a moment. And the last bullet on this point, 18 million over the next 3 years to build capacity of the supported internship program. Our view on this is it's not enough. You know, we don't just need supported internships. We don't just need 18 million in supported internships. We need a wholesale view of what happens to children when they leave education. One of the criticisms we've got is that this green paper is very, very education based. Again, more on that later. So I'll briefly scan through what it says on alternative provision. So making AP an integrated part of the local SEND systems by requiring the new local SEND partnerships to plan and deliver. So again, bringing SEND, bringing AP into the much closer to the SEND system, because the fact of the matter is that the majority of children who end up in AP actually have SEND. Technical stuff around how AP schools are funded, because at the moment they do not have stability of funding. They have a great deal of insecurity in their funding, and that greater stability has been welcomed by the AP sector. But frankly, will local authorities have the money to properly fund AP? Because at the moment we all know what's been happening to local authority budgets over the last few years. More on APs being required to join multi-academy trusts. I'll say more on that when we get to the school's white paper. Just bespoke performance framework for alternative provision. Sounds good. We don't know what it means. We haven't got enough detail to comment on that. The next two proposals we actually do are broadly very positive about, which is greater oversight and transparency into pupil movements. So if a child is leaving a school, let's find out where they're going and why they're going. And also a call for evidence on the use of unregistered provision. Again, less of an issue, particularly for SEND children, but we do know that a lot of children vulnerable children end up in quite in an unregistered provision. And of course, we all know there's risks there. Okay, this is quite important, the section on system roles, accountabilities and funding reform. So they're talking about delivering clarity in roles and responsibilities with every partner across education, healthcare, and local government having a clear role to play and equipped with levers to fulfill their responsibilities. This is absolutely critical, because one of the things we think went wrong with the 2014 reforms is that the incentives for leaders in the system were just not aligned, and they just weren't SEND friendly or inclusive. School leaders, as Tina said earlier, school leaders were motivated by attendance, by behavior, by attainment, not by inclusion. There's talk of restructuring that to bring that much more in line. However, we haven't seen enough detail about how this is going to work, and this accountability is going to be absolutely critical. But as well as accountability, we talk about incentives, because rather than holding somebody to account when they've done something wrong, we would much rather incentivize them to do the right thing in the first place. So if you align the money, if you align the governance, if you align the inspections regime to be very, very SEND inclusive, then actually maybe you don't need so much of the accountability. But at the moment, we're very dependent on that accountability. So I think we need to get the incentives and the accountability right. Next up is talking about the new DFE regions group. So the regions group is talked about more extensively in the schools white paper. And this is essentially a tacit recognition that the regional schools commissioners are no longer fit for purpose, that they were originally set up as literally as commissioners to commission schools, to be as a conduit to money to academy schools that are no longer local authority maintained. But they've been asked to perform a regulatory role, and they've been ill-equipped to do this. They haven't had the right oversight, they haven't had the right powers, they haven't had the right incentives or interest, frankly, in doing this when it comes to SEND children. So there's the new regional, new regions group, regional directors, I think they're the language is in the white paper for the DFE, and they will be replacing the schools commissioners. So we agree the current setup isn't fit for purpose, but we need to understand how these new regional schools directors will fit into the structure and how they'll look at SEND. So really pleasing next up is that there's been introduced into the health and care bill statutory guidance for the new integrated care boards as to what their duties are with regards to SEND. So that is very encouraging, and that's actually in the health and care bill, the Health and Care Act that's just become law. Next up is a big one, which is they introduce a new national framework for banding and price tariffs. So let's pause for a minute. They're essentially saying that the local areas will have less autonomy when it comes to setting the bandings when it comes to needs of children with SEND. That's to prevent some of the huge local variation that we have and the regional variation that we have. So there'll be some sort of national framework around what a person with this level of needs and these conditions should be getting. There's also going to be the flip side of that is going to be national tariffs. Again, with some regional variation to allow for cost of living differences between the regions. But this is the tariffs bit is really important, because this could price certain schools out of the market. And lastly, there's a requirement in this section to work with Ofsted and CQC to deliver a new local area inspection framework. That's something we've been aware of. That's something where we as the NNPCF are already working with Ofsted and CQC on. So we'll continue to do that and keep you updated on that. One of the things that went wrong in the 2014 reforms is there wasn't enough focus on implementation. They just did not think long and hard enough about how the system would be changed to create the new system that we needed, the new accountability, new incentives, the new services that were needed. And that's been to some extent corrected in this, and that they're talking about the national standards that we spoke about earlier. being developed with leaders across education, health and care, and also including parents. That's great. And the new National Send Delivery Board that will be set up, which will oversee the national standards, will include parents again. So they're talking about some new structures and some new frameworks there that are SEND specific. However, again, we haven't seen what those standards are. We haven't seen what that new framework is. We don't know what this delivery plan looks like. And until we see all of that, we're not really in a position to comment. And as I said earlier, a lot of how this these proposed reforms deliver or not will depend on how they are implemented. I'm going to spend a little bit of time, step away from the green paper, if I may, and talk about the schools white paper, because this is really important. We talked earlier, Tina talked earlier about the 2014 reforms being the right reforms in the wrong environment. Well, the schools white paper is going to be critical to the environment that we create for our children going forward. This is going to be the environment that schools are going to be operating in, and this is going to be the piece of legislation that sets really the incentives and accountability for schools. So what does that say? The first thing it says is that all schools must be in the process of joining a strong multi-academy trust by 2030. Really pleasing, really pleasing for us is that we have got in there that the strong multi-academy trust is, quote unquote, one that provides a high quality and inclusive education. That's the definition of a strong multi-academy trust. The word inclusive is in there. And I don't think it would have been in there had this white paper been released 2 to 3 years ago. But joining a multi-academy trust doesn't change really anything for our kids, in that we all know that there are some good trusts and there are some bad trusts, some trusts that get it and some that don't. Next up, there's a requirement that 90% of pupils will meet the expected standard of reading, writing and maths at Key Stage 2. So let's think about that for a moment. Given that 15% of children in schools at the moment have some form of SEND, that on one level gives schools a really strong incentive to be inclusive, because there's no way they can hit that 90% target unless they are inclusive, unless they are supportive of children with SEND. However, it also is going to give schools a motive not to be inclusive, because we all know there are some schools that will turn around and say, that's a bit hard. Let's not admit the children with SEND. That's the easiest way of us getting to our 90%. So again, how this is going to be enforced is going to be absolutely critical. Because if some schools start to try and game the system and figure out that actually they can game the system by not being inclusive and therefore have a greater chance of hitting the 90%, that is going to be a huge problem. Next up, there's a parent pledge that schools will provide evidence-based support if a child falls behind in maths or English. So that's to be welcome, because evidence-based support is always good. So parents will be able to demand that extra support. But what we need to make sure is that extra support includes things like the services that our kids access, such as speech and language therapy, mental health, emotional health. So it can't be just academic support. 6 million tutoring courses by 2024. Again, we want to make sure there's targeted and specialist tutoring available that our children can access. Next up is better behavior and attendance data through more effective use of data. Again, we just need to make sure these measures are right, because if you start using crude measures around attendance and behavior, that's going to be a really strong incentive for schools not to be inclusive. And a new arm's length curriculum body. We need to figure out how SEND needs will be represented in this new arm's length curriculum body. So what I've done there is a very, very quick run through of the school's white paper and the SEND green paper. What we want to do at this stage I'm really conscious there's lots of activity in the chat that we're not getting to at the moment. But what we want to do at this stage is get your initial feedback on some of these proposals. So can you please go to mentee.com and enter the code 994-96736. You do that on your so come in, Tina.
Yeah, we have had some response, but we have over 100 people on the call, and at the moment, oh, it's going up now because we've mentioned it again. I keep putting it in the chat, so apologies, Marina, if it keeps pinging. But yeah, if you can use the mentee, because that's really important, because we will use that as part of our evidence, and we'll touch on what else we're doing later on.
Okay, so we're starting to get these questions through. So we've asked, I think we've asked 5 questions here, which are just starting to unpack some of the key proposals in the SEND green paper and the white paper. So do you think we need national SEND standards? So overwhelmingly, people are saying yes there. I'll let that tick on for a little bit longer. I'm really pleased with that, because that shows that we are consistent, in the sense that when we went into those the negotiations from the SEND steering group, we were basing the fact that we thought we needed national standards on what you guys were telling us. So I'm really pleased that you've been consistent over the last few years.
Carolyn, if you've got a phone nearby, if you're using Zoom on your computer, you can use your phone and go through the browser, which is why I put the link in the chat. But you can also, if you go onto mentee.com on your browser on your phone, you can then put the code in then, if that's helpful. And apologies if you're using your phone.
Yeah, you can. I should have said earlier, you can use your phone for this. Okay, great. So I'm going to click over to the next question, because we've got overwhelming support for the national SEND standards. So the next question is, what would make you accept the introduction of a list for schools that family can express a preference on? So we gave you 4 options here, which were a list that's created by local authorities and schools. No support for that at all so far. A list that's created by local authorities, schools, and local health and care services. There's no support for that at the moment. A list that's created by local authorities, schools, health and care services with parent carer forum input. So a little bit of support for that. And then the majority of you just can't get on board with the idea that you've got to choose your placement from a list of schools. Again, really, really strong feedback there. Thank you, guys. And those results are keep them coming in. What I'll do is I'll flip forward to the next slide. Do you support the introduction of a new national framework of bandings and tariffs for funding matched to levels of need and provision? Okay, so a lot of this is really interesting. So the winner here at this point in time is not sure, but tends to be significantly more yeses than no's. So quite a bit of a split.
And I can put some context into that, Marino, because people are really struggling about what it looks like. So the green paper has issued all of this findings and things, but there's no meat on those bones. So no one really understands what it's going to look like. So they can't put a judgment on it because they don't know what it's going to do or what it actually physically looks like. So yeah, which is what we said in the steering group, didn't we? We did say that.
This is a real double-edged sword, isn't it? Because whilst we all want to, everybody agrees with the need to remove the postcode lottery and remove those huge local and regional variations that we sometimes see. Whilst everybody also agrees with the need, the fact that there are some independent schools out there that are making a huge amount of money out of the state system and out of our children, and we don't agree with that. But we also are very careful to say that actually provision should be needs led, and there are some children who have phenomenally complex needs and their needs should be met, and that shouldn't be capped by these sorts of tariffs. And I think that will need more detail. And I suspect where we'll go with things like that is actually those are the individual packages that will need to be jointly funded through health, education and care, and through continuing care funding and things like that. But I think this is a really wise result you're giving us here, which is that we're just not sure until we see more meat on the bones. Okay, moving on. Do you support mandatory mediation? Actually, again, a little bit split, but overwhelmingly no. And at this stage, quite a lot of not sure as well. And again, I think we can understand the not sure, because until we understand exactly whether it's how it's going to work, whether it's going to be binding or not, what the rights of parents will be when they're going through that mediation, we don't know. But at the moment, people are broadly not in support of the proposals of mandatory mediation.
And it came up in my regional consultation with the SEND review team, is actually that this has been mentioned before. So this mandatory mediation actually came in before the 2014 review, SEND reforms, and it was taken out at the last minute. So again, it's what it looks like, and whether or not it's going to be, it might be mandatory, but then is the the result of the mediation, is it going to be recommendations, or is it going to be legally binding? And I think that's the issue, isn't it? And certainly that's what's sort of said in the chat. And also it's offering, if we have mandatory mediation and it doesn't work out, then you end up tribunal. If that's the course of action, are we just delaying tactics here? And that's what's also come through in the chat.
Really strong messages, thank you. Do you think that setting a target that 90% of pupils must achieve expected levels of reading and writing Key Stage 2 will make schools more inclusive? Oh, you're a cynical bunch out there, aren't you? No is the answer, and I'm sorry to say that I think I agree with you, and that unless this is managed and enforced, I think that there's too big a risk here that schools will game this system, that this will incentivize schools not to be inclusive. And for them, we know it happens already. We hear it all the time in every pretty much local area of schools that will suggest to pupils and to families that this maybe isn't the right setting for them and they shouldn't apply to this one, and maybe they should go to the one up the road when they've got an SEND. So yeah, really, really strong feedback there. And we're going to flip on. There we go. That's the last slide. Thank you. That is absolutely brilliant. Because you've given us, this is a pulse check of our thinking and where we're positioning things, and to be able to get that feedback from you so strongly at this stage has been fantastic. And this will really shape our conversations with the Department for Education and others over the coming weeks. So let me just sum up quickly of where I think we've got to. So there's actually much in the Green Paper that we're supportive of, particularly the point around national standards. And I said this earlier, that national standards mean you end up with potentially, if they're implemented properly, no dispute around what families are entitled to, as well as clarity for schools. That will help drive early intervention. It helps us set clarity over who pays for what, which will help us to deliver better local area planning and make dispute resolution easier, because everybody knows what should be being provided. And I think that this is where the mandatory mediation idea hangs on as well. It's the idea that if you've got national standards, mandatory mediation should be really simple, because everybody knows what you're entitled to, so the mediation should be simple, and therefore theoretically reduces the need for tribunal. But as we've just been through with the polling we've done, there's a good deal of skepticism about how well that last row will be implemented. But there's also lots and lots of things that we're really worried about. So naming a place on EHCPs, and you've given us a really strong message on that. How will it all fit together? How will the new incentives, responsibilities, powers, accountability and regulation in the new system work? Will there be these little gaps that our children fall through? What will the new redress process look like? Again, we've talked about mandatory mediation and how that might work, and when and how tribunals will be played in. What happens if a child doesn't, if a family doesn't agree with the list of tailored settings? Equally well, we've got lots of concerns around bandings and tariffs, and you've just played that back to us in the polling we've just done as well. And then the last two things at the bottom there, we don't think that this green paper says enough about wider outcomes. There's going to be a lot of children who come through the system who are not destined for further education, training or work. What about them? What about the more holistic outcomes such as independent living and community inclusion that we know are so important to young adults with SEND, who end up being isolated, who end up living in their parents' bedroom when they're, when they're 30 years old. There's not enough around where the destinations for these children are, what the real outcomes for these children are, over and above the academic, over and above education, training and work. And finally, we don't think that this paper says enough about health and social care. It's just silent on a lot of health and social care requirements. And I understand that that's because the Children's Social Care Review, which was published this morning, has been ongoing. We understand that that's the health system is restacking itself following the Health and Care Bill. But I think that there needs to be more of a aspiration and a direction set in there that for health and social care in this green paper. And we can't forget the context. There's a real danger. We are really, really worried that SEND gets lost because the agenda and priorities of schools are going to be dominated by the school's white paper. So, our head teacher is going to be sitting there worried about how they get to be more inclusive, or are they going to be worried about what their attainment stats are going to look like with this new 90% target, what their behavior and attendance stats are going to look like, because that's in the school's white paper. And we all know that attainment, behavior and attendance are risk issues for children and young people with SEND, and will that incentivize them to be less inclusive? Similarly with the health service and the line there, we await the Children's Social Care Review, as I said, was published this morning. The next point is that implementation is going to be absolutely key. We talked about this earlier, but we didn't implement the 2014 reforms properly. There wasn't enough of a focus on what implementation really looked like. They've recognized that in this green paper, and there's a lot on the implementation plans and the National SEND Delivery Board, which is positive, but we haven't got enough detail of what that implementation will look like to really comment and opine on whether we're supportive or not. But again, we'll continue to work with the DFE on what that looks like. And then the last point I think is really important. We can't wait another 5 years. We're in crisis now. So if you've got local authorities or CCGs that are saying, yeah, we'll fix that when the SEND Green Paper becomes law, please, please, please call them out. We know that families are in crisis now. Our children won't get these years back. So it's really important we continue, the forums play a huge role in driving continuous improvement, holding local areas to account and continue to improve the system as it is now. And we're doing our bit at the NNPCF, and we've been speaking to the Department for Education on this topic, and they did a webinar for us, and you can see a link to that in this paper here. That webinar, if I remember rightly, was done in early May. It was presented by Susie Powell from the Department for Education and Fiona Nzegwu from the Department for Education Deputy Directors. So please, if you haven't seen that webinar, please go and look it up. We'll distribute these slides afterwards. So over to you, Tina.
Thank you. So we're going to talk through now our next steps and what we're doing with the NNPCF, and this is obviously local as well. Well, it's actually regional and national. So next slide, please. So the DFE Send Review team are visiting or attending regional meetings. Some have already happened, so the Southwest has already happened, and I know a couple of I think happened in the Southeast as well. So just speak to your regional rep to see if yours has happened yet, and there will be some more ongoing sort of June as well. Minister Quince has agreed to host a national engagement event. That's now going to be on the 11th of July. We have the date confirmed on Friday. This webinar, please share, and we will also make the slides available as well. I think they're going to be put on our website for people to view. And also we will be running workshops throughout to sort of stress test, if you like, what's the proposed new systems and how it's going to work in reality, because I think that's really important. And looking at the chat about you're not sure how it's going to look like, what's going to happen, I think that's really, really important that we do that. And please respond to the consultation. So the National Send Review consultation, please respond to it as individuals, forums, regions, because we will be doing it as the NNPCF as well. And make sure that you share it with anybody and everybody within your local area, whether they're part of the forum or not. Share it far and wide, because the more people that we can get to consult on this, the better it will be. And certainly the conversations I've had around the questions and the little gap underneath that you put your response in, some people are saying that the question's not relevant. Just use the box. Just use the box how you see fit. You're not required to answer the question. If the question's not quite what you want an answer to, then put it in that box. You don't have to respond to the question above if it's not relevant. Put your own individuality in that box. And the link for that was on the bottom of that box there. Sorry, Marina, thank you. Next slide, please. And we are going to be doing a consultation. It is live. Here is the link. You can use the QR code if you've got your phone to hand. Again, it is for every single person to respond. So it's not just about forums. It is every parent carer that you can think of. Share it far and wide. The idea is that we want to get our own response to a survey, to the thoughts around the green paper. It does take 10 to 15 minutes. We've all tested it. The questions are very simple to answer. They're not onerous, but there is just quite a few of them. And please share this with your membership and anybody else to complete it, because we want to make this as big as possible. We are going to be sharing this survey with other organisations like DCP, like Special Needs Jungle, and the hope that we can then get as many responses as we can. And this survey, the responses will form part of our NNPCF response to the green paper. Again, this will be shared out. It will be going out to an email to all forums, but please complete it. Yes, I can share the link on the survey in the chat, possibly. I'll have a go.
So thank you everybody for attending today. A few takeaways for you. So, as Tina says, please complete the consultation, and please just send this survey out to everybody. We want thousands of responses. The more responses we get to this survey, the stronger our response is going to be to the Department for Education, the more evidence we can bring to bear. And I think we desperately do need this survey, because the consultation will not be accessible to everybody. It is quite the official Department for Education consultation is quite a difficult document, and there's some of the questions in there, I've had to read 2 or 3 times, and I'm still not sure I quite understand them, frankly. Also, some of the questions in the official consultation are a little bit leading. So, for example, it doesn't ask you whether you think having a magic list of schools you get to choose from is a good idea or not. All it asks is, how do we make this list work well? And I think it's really important that if you disagree with the idea of a list, you've got the opportunity to say so And our survey gives you that opportunity to say, actually, I disagree with the idea of a list, for example. So it cuts out some of the leading questions in the consultation. So please send that survey to everybody you know, and as Tina says, we'll be sending it out ourselves.
And one last thing before we end the webinar, do send out a feedback sheet after every single session. Please, can you just take the 2 minutes it takes to fill in that feedback? We can only develop webinars that are useful if we have your feedback. So if we are really bad, then please obviously tell us. But the chat has been very kind to us, actually, Marina, and they found it really helpful, which is great. But please feedback to us, because we want to put on some useful webinars. We know that an hour out of your day is a lot, and actually if we can make sure that we provide good webinars that you want to take the time out to listen to, then it's really helpful for us to do that. So please feedback to contact when you get your feedback form.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a really great session in the sense that you've given us some fantastic feedback. The Mentee slides are gold dust. I have the dubious honour of going to the Education Select Committee tomorrow, and I'll be quoting from the stats you've given us today in that session. So thank you, everybody. And without any further ado, I
was just going to add as well that we do have a steering group meeting for the Send Review green paper this week, and so we will be using those findings as well. So that's really important, as well as the very important Select Committee. But thank you very much for everybody who's taken an hour out their day on a Monday. It's no mean feat, because Mondays are never easy, but thank you very much for your time, and thank you for joining us.